Hello folks, and welcome to another edition of the Dr. Mark Foster Show. Today I will present some informal ramblings on why critical realism and the philosophy of metareality or metarealism, as developed by British philosopher Roy Bhaskar, fall into what is generally called the intellectual left, or I would say especially with metarealism, the spiritual left. Unfortunately, I would say, the market on spirituality, or perhaps religiosity, at least in the United States, has been cornered to a large extent by people on the religious right. In fact, I think it was Ann Coulter who said that it's impossible to be a liberal and a Christian. Well, I am neither. I'm not a liberal. Liberalism referring to the middle left, and I'm also not a Christian. I'm a Baha'i. Although I am not political, in the sense that I am not involved in partisan politics, I don't campaign for people to run for political office, I try to avoid taking positions on controversial political issues, divisive political issues. Not sure if I'm always completely successful at that, but that's my objective. But from a spiritual and an intellectual standpoint, I think that I would certainly fall under the category of the intellectual and spiritual left. It's been with me my entire life. Before I was a Baha'i, became a Baha'i when I was 14 years old, at the end of 1970. But before then, I was very politically active. Even in, I believe it was 7th grade, I got involved with a group called the Students' Democratic Coalition, which was informally connected with the Democratic Party in the United States. And at least our chapter of the Students' Democratic Coalition, which, as I recall, was run by a 7th grade girl named Stephanie Erickson, was very politically active. We went and picketed a supermarket at one time. That supermarket was selling California grapes, and in solidarity with the Migrant Workers Union, because of the horrendous way that migrant workers were being treated at that time, and really to an extent now as well. We went and picketed a supermarket and handed out petitions encouraging people to pledge not to purchase California grapes. And I think to a large extent that campaign was somewhat successful. In addition, I attended a campaign meeting for the Humphrey Muskie campaign back in 1968, when Humphrey and Muskie came to my neighborhood in the New York City area. It was shortly after we had left New York City itself and moved out to the suburbs. And I was there and saw Hubert Humphrey speak. It was kind of inspiring to me. He had always been a hero of mine, and I was very happy to have the opportunity to see him, although it was from a considerable distance. Also, we were in the Students' Democratic Coalition, very interested in the Vietnam War, protesting against the Vietnam War, protesting against anti-ballistic missiles, or ABMs. So just generally, pretty much, I guess, left of center causes. I'm not sure if I would exactly say left-wing causes, which is a term that at least I reserve for the far left, but certainly left of center causes. As I matured, my views stayed on the left. That was at various times a struggle for me, because there were various points in my life when I really wanted to become politically active. There were certain things that I saw, which I won't mention, it's not necessary, that had me very concerned over the years, and I felt that if I were able to become politically active, that perhaps I could in some way contribute to the betterment of American society and perhaps even the world. Over time, I realized that that was not a very wise approach for a couple of reasons. One, the obvious, Baha'is are not supposed to be involved in partisan politics. And second, a purely pragmatic consideration, that it occurred to me that that type of approach to resolving problems generally doesn't work that well. If we look at the United States right now, at least as I am speaking in April of 2013, we see tremendous divisions in the United States. People on either side of the aisle in Washington are barely able to speak with one another. There do seem to be some compromises, but there's just such hostility between liberals and conservatives in Washington, D.C. And the United States as a whole does appear to me to be very much split. I notice that online with the constant flaming or attack that goes on YouTube, on Facebook, on various message boards that I participate in from time to time, including one that is primarily devoted to autism. But a lot of people there, I've noticed, do tend to be rather right of center, oftentimes libertarian. Not sure if that's just my own observation, but it does seem to me that autistics do tend to be rather libertarian, in some cases even anarchist, at least as those terms are defined in the United States. I realize that in Europe the terms are used in a somewhat different way. But in other words, radical individualism. Even some people who subscribe to Ayn Rand's objectivism, a lot of atheists, agnostics, religious skeptics, and people with similar ways of looking at the world. So, I have often felt, when I have participated in many of these forums, especially the autistic ones, since those draw me to them for obvious reasons, because I am autistic, I have felt as if I were like a fish out of water, in a sense alienated from my own community. When I post something, express a view which I suppose is more left of center, I generally get attacked for it. So I have, as a result, pretty much stopped posting there, or at least stopped posting on those kinds of subjects there, and have, when I go there, I pretty much just help out with people who are having problems and try to coach them or provide a a sense of support for autistics, particularly those who have been just recently diagnosed. It seems to me like just yesterday that my diagnosis was corrected from childhood schizophrenia to autism, but actually it's going back to 2007, so it's become a fairly long time now, relatively speaking. What happened as I matured as a sociologist? I was drawn to a Marxist approach to sociology. By Marxist, I mean an emancipatory approach, an anti-capitalist approach, a pro-socialist approach, and at times even a pro-communist approach. Many people don't understand the difference between socialism and communism as those ideas were developed in the works of Marx and Engels. Many people think that communism is something like what exists, say, in North Korea, or what existed in Stalinist Russia, or perhaps what exists right now in Cuba. But in fact, according to Marx, that is not communism. Communism is a condition of society where two conditions are present. First, there is no government, literally, the elimination of government, no vertical authority structure. So in that sense, communism as developed by Marx and Engels is essentially an anarchistic condition. Second is the elimination of a class structure, that divisions or inequalities between people based on economic status and based upon capitalists as the owners of production and workers as those who are subordinated to them would also be eliminated. Over time, I have recognized that that approach is not especially comparable with the Baha'i teachings. And so I've moved away from it, and I do consider myself to be a rather strong socialist, but I no longer use the word communist in reference to myself. Instead, pardon me, instead I would refer to myself as someone with a view that combines maybe state socialism with democratic socialism, something like collectivization, where the major industries would be owned and operated by a government, whether at a federal or a local level, and the most other businesses, medium-sized businesses, would be collectivized. In other words, would be run by the workers, or in some cases by the depositors, as with a credit union, for example. And then smaller businesses, say businesses where somebody is self-employed, or perhaps in a business where there are only a couple of employees. Those kinds of businesses would be allowed to function as private enterprises with very strict control, so that if there were any cases of demonstrated abuse or oppression by those owners of companies, the company would be seized from them and placed into either governmental or public hands, public ownership. So I am a socialist. I have described a particular variation of socialism, which is called by various names, including associational socialism, but there are various names for it. name doesn't really matter that much. About a decade ago, I was drawn to Critical Realism of Roy Bhaskar. Roy Bhaskar's approach is complex. There are Marxist elements to it, but I don't think it would be fair to Bhaskar to say that his approach is purely Marxist. There are many influences on critical realism. Certainly critical realism is compatible with Marxism, or at least some interpretations of Marxism, but it is a much broader perspective than Marxism. Although to say that critical realism is Marxist, I don't think would be incorrect. Like other Marxist approaches, there is an emphasis on domination and emancipation. In other words, that people are oppressed or dominated, and any social theorist or philosopher would study or attempt to explain the dynamics of that domination, but in addition would present a type of practice or methodology through which people who are subjected to oppression or domination could become emancipated. And that is also very much a part of critical realism. It's also a part of critical theory, but one of the significant differences between critical realism and critical theory is that critical realism includes a very strong sense of what is reality. In other words, a sense of ontology, which is reality or existence. Whereas critical theory has tended to a more social constructionist approach, namely an approach which views reality as consensual, perhaps as conversational, not as something which lies beyond the level of social constructions. For various reasons, I began maybe about 8 years ago to move away from critical realism. The reasons for that are complex, and there's no need for me to go into them. I don't want to bore you with that. But I was drawn for various reasons to social constructionism, to critical theory. The hybrid of critical theory and social constructionism is sometimes called new critical theory, and I identified myself as a new critical theorist or as a social constructionist. New critical theory is also basically a Marxist approach. Then again, over time, I returned to critical realism. What I discovered was that Roy Bhaskar had gone through a similar experience or discovery of emancipation to myself. I had experienced an emancipation from autism. In fact, I now call myself an emancipated autist, not to brag, but as an expression of gratitude for how my Lord and how my spiritual family in the next world, including my departed parents, my spiritual mother, my guardian angel, Hadrat Sultan Bahu, and others, I think, interceded for me and led me back to my Lord, Baha'u'llah, in a much deeper sense than I had before. What Bhaskar had done over that period of time that I had pretty much gone away from critical realism is he had developed critical realism in a new direction called the philosophy of metareality, or sometimes metaRealism. What distinguishes metaRealism from critical realism in its prior phases is an emphasis on spirituality, on non-duality, on the ground state, or on, as Bhaskar has called it, the cosmic envelope, or co-presence. There are various words for it that all have similar, maybe not exact, but similar definitions, related definitions. And what co-presence is, as Bhaskar has explained it, is a condition of unity in difference, or, as I would say, unity in diversity. It's a condition of unity, or non-duality. It is the ground state of existence. It is what I discovered. To me, that is the emancipatory left, and Bhaskar himself considers metarealism to be left, in the sense that its focus is on emancipation from oppression, from domination, rather than people who are religious or spiritual, but perhaps have a more right position, are generally interested in things like tradition, maintaining family values as they define family values, which are generally not the way I would define them. And so, because of the fact that metareality or metarealism does focus on emancipation, which is a left concept, a spiritual left concept, and an intellectual left concept, Bhaskar does consider it to be a part of the left, as do I. And so, what I think that metarealism has done is it has allowed people with a left perspective in sociology, philosophy, and other fields, anthropology, to have a home in their fields, not to be isolated, to be able to explore emancipation on a spiritual level without having to buy into the ideology of domination, which is held to by many people on the religious right, such as a support of capitalism. There's a very close connection between the religious right and support of capitalism. Well, I am not a capitalist. I don't support capitalism. I am a socialist, as I've said. So, that is appealing to me. So I would encourage anybody who is in a situation like myself, who has experienced or perhaps wishes to experience emancipation, but is not a right-winger and does not want to give up that quest for liberation or emancipation in order to achieve unity and spirituality, to consider the philosophy of metareality and critical realism. I think it is a sense of home At least that's the way it feels to me. Meta-reality is home for me in my field. So if you identify with anything I've said, please Google Roy Bhaskar, Google meta-reality, Google Critical Realism. I have plenty of things I have written on those subjects as well. And consider supporting the project. It needs supporters. It is still, compared to many other approaches, such as, say, Ken Wilber's integralism, it is still a pretty small area. Not that many of us, relatively speaking. So we do need more people. So if you are a realist or a critical realist, in other words, you recognize that there is a real, but that real is interpreted by us. There is a difference between knowledge and reality, or, technically speaking, between epistemology and ontology. And you want to have that sense of unity or togetherness, or to find a supportive community, primarily of academics, but not entirely, of people who are on a similar journey, then again, I would hope that you would look at meta-realism. Until next time, this is Dr. Mark Foster. Have a good one.